I've made a few different Marvel videos in the past couple months, and whenever I bring up or use a clip of a particular female version of a well-known hero, a lot of people seem to come out of the woodwork just to state how much they hate her as a person, her fictional character, or just think her show is terrible. And because I have a YouTube channel that I can spread my voice to a grand total of about 100 of you guys, I see you sandwich enjoyers out there and appreciate you, but I want to use this substandardly successful platform to address the hate and vitriol that is spread throughout a fandom that, by all intents and purposes, should be inclusive and welcoming to people of all backgrounds. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before I get to that part of the video that will inspire a war in the comments, I want to talk about the savage, jolly green giant herself. Welcome to Sandwich Reviews. I'm the Talking Sentient Sandwich, and I have a pretty good idea why people don't actually like She-Hulk, but we'll get there, because I thought her show was amazing, and has only gotten better upon rewatches. First off, I know that everyone has a right to their own opinion, and if you truly don't want to watch this show, there's no reason why you have to like it. Just don't attack other people for liking it, because that's unnecessary. Everyone's allowed to like whatever they want to like. But before diving into the character and narrative reasons why I think this show objectively works, I should talk about Marvel's marketing problem, because She-Hulk wasn't the only show that was sold as standard superhero affair, despite it being the furthest you can get from that. At that time especially, audiences were getting plenty of superhero schlock, so I can't really blame some fans for just wanting more of the same. It may not be as original, but getting more of the same is safe and most of the time reliable. But WandaVision, Ms. Marvel, and She-Hulk were all advertised as big action CGI fests that would be a thrill to watch from start to finish. And they were a thrill, but that doesn't have anything to do with spendy action set pieces, which is what some fans demand without any thought about the story surrounding those action sequences. Even so, there are people out there who simply aren't interested in a show like She-Hulk or WandaVision, and again, that's fine. It's the people who watch it and hate it for not being something it was never intended to be in the first place. These shows should have been advertised as the product that they were, whether that be a stylized throwback to TV across the decades, a quick and snappy teen comedy with fun editing, at least for the first few episodes, or a sitcom about a lawyer taking on a new superhero case each episode. Those shows would have done infinitely better if the audience was more prepared and clued into what they were getting. Of course, there are plenty of trailers for those projects that state that, but being overly crystal clear is sadly a necessity. She-Hulk does make a point of saying exactly what should be expected in the first episode of her show, so I don't know how someone can still have that misunderstanding, but I guess some still expected a top-notch movie-level Hulk fight every episode, and that was just never what She-Hulk was meant to be. And not just that, after the first episode, the show still took every chance to let the audience know to temper their expectations when it came to the action and when it came to the cameos. Which, for that second one, the show still knocked it out of the park. From Wongers to Daredevil, I couldn't have imagined a better display of familiar faces. But we'll get to the many cameos, because if you look back to those 3 Disney Plus shows I brought up earlier, you'll find that they do have an incidental similarity connecting them, but for the life of me, I can't think of what that could be, or why a particularly terrible subsection of Marvel fans would dislike them. But in all seriousness, they do all feature crazy action and effects. But of those 3, Ms. Marvel was the only one that had consistent episode-by-episode action, and yet people still found a way to hate on it, review bombing it for the most vile reasons possible. Though I'm not here to talk about Ms. Marvel or how phenomenally perfect Iman Vellani is for the role, and I don't think it's quite to the point of Ms. Marvel's no one could possibly play her as well, but Tatiana Maslany is incredible as She-Hulk. On a comedic level, which frankly is the most important, she perfectly conveys the smug, do-it-herself character of Jen Walters, and when needed, busts out the dramatic chops to bring the narrative together in the end. And if you had seen even a small percentage of Orphan Black like me, you'd know that she was the right choice as soon as she got the part. And she's got the perfect She-Hulk hair that was for some reason entirely replaced with boring straight hair, which is disappointing, but is also overshadowed by the touch-and-go CG that dips wildly during the middle of the season. Which honestly, the overall She-Hulk look, regardless of the quality of the effects, is okay. Not the worst, but could definitely be better. I mean, even when the VFX look flawless, I still don't love the look, and that could come down to the TV budget that this show is working with. I know that it's Disney and Marvel, but with this being an episodic TV show, that means that there is just more screen time for the VFX artist to work on, and less importance on the grand shots. Because instead of those stunning shots being reserved for the rare moments so that they can be focused on and dialed into perfection, there were thousands of shots that needed to be done yesterday. And that's only one of the many reasons why CG tends to look less believable than it did 10 years ago, and a conversation for another day. Because as far as She-Hulk's look is concerned, and I mentioned it with Tatiana Maslany's hair, I genuinely believe if given those curls, I would instantly like the look more. Her supersuit, on the other hand, was never going to look good. Besides ripped purple shorts, Hulk and his cousin have never really been given anything as far as iconic clothes go. So what else were they really going to get? I say that, and then the majority of the time She-Hulk is suited up in the comics, she is seen with the same purple and white leotard, and just like the hair, it wouldn't have been hard to style her costume off of the comics a little more closely, because the extra colors, patches, and lines are very typical of Marvel translating a simple comic book look and only making that look come off as generic. But I have faith that her look and costume will get an update by the next time we see her, including better CG, possibly curlier hair, and definitely a simpler suit. And moving away from the show's look to the story itself, I cannot commend the writers enough for being as forward-thinking as they were, predicting the exact response they got and getting in front of it. And it wasn't like those comments were added late in the process. They had to be written months in advance. Now, the toxic response that they got is a very predictable one, and I'm sure it's easy to anticipate the small amount of buzzwords and topics shouted into the destructive sides of the internet, yet it couldn't have been easy to foretell the terrible comments that people make, in some cases verbatim. And phenomenal writing aside, the fact that we got a unique superhero lawsuit almost every episode just makes watching this a blast. In fact, if I could point out one serious problem that I had with this season, it's that more focus should have been given to the lawyer stuff. Not that I disliked anything else, because character drama is very necessary in any narrative, but I was immediately more engaged whenever they were in a court setting, or whenever someone would be talking about a case that they were working on. With that, we got fun inclusions like Mr. Invincible and Leapfrog, but I deeply loved everything about the Magic episode, especially the fact that within that narrative, She-Hulk attempts to stop someone from performing or using a particular brand. And even though she is in the right because he's putting people in harm's way, it's that gray area in the legal system, which is why I love seeing courtroom scenes with Daredevil or She-Hulk or just any scene like that. That space can be explored infinitely, and I'm surprised it hasn't been utilized by superhero franchises more. And another thing that could have been utilized better, even though I did like the final antagonistic group, was Titania. And she was a weird inclusion, and was put in probably just because the comic run the show has most similarity to has Titania as the villain, but I still enjoyed seeing her, if only because I'll enjoy seeing any kind of reminder of The Good Place, because that show is amazing. But even that isn't enough to tip her over the line and make her character good or even significant, though I am willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, because she's not the real villain. The true antagonist of the overarching She-Hulk show is Intelligentsia, which every Redditor probably took as a personal attack, but I thought that that whole idea was the perfect embodiment of the worst kinds of toxic fans. Of course, they can't depict the actual extent of hate and abuse that sadly happens, but the show is still able to bring up those themes, and goes much further than I ever expected a Disney Plus show to go in the penultimate episode. That right there was what the show was about. It was also there to give you funny dialogue and constant jokes, but not once was action ever its selling point. Besides, the good action was mainly reserved for episode 8, the Daredevil episode, which to talk about specifically, that episode is the reason why I have faith that any kind of added cameo character can work, for a movie or a TV show or whatever. It doesn't matter how natural or how difficult it might be to shoehorn a familiar character into a story. In this case, the writers managed to relate everything about Daredevil coming into this show to developing and informing Jen's character. It was definitely awesome to see Matt, and probably did bring in a bunch of viewers who previously were not watching the show, but that episode clearly wasn't about him. It introduced Daredevil and featured him heavily, yet he was only there for Jen to finally realize being She-Hulk doesn't have to be all bad, and that she can do some real good so long as she views it as a gift rather than the curse that she had decided it was. Which led nicely into the finale, where she had her power and freedom stripped away following a 100% justified rampage. And honestly, I unexpectedly enjoyed the slightly tedious dramatic aspect of the finale much more than the meta stuff, which seems backwards, because I love whenever a story gets meta even more than I love a one-take fight scene. But stopping the narrative to talk to the writers of the show and addressing how bad the finale was just didn't work as well as it could have. Which sucks, because on paper, that sounds brilliant. Although, when the show cuts to the main Marvel home screen, it doesn't look entirely convincing, but for a split second, I did reach for my remote, so they got me. And to quickly talk about my hopes for a season 2, I've already mentioned how I want more court scenes, but a character addition that I would enjoy seeing a lot is Betsy Ross. Those who know what has recently been done to her character will know why I want to see her in a She-Hulk show, but I won't spoil it for those who haven't kept up to date with the comics. All I'll say is it could be a lot of fun. But now is the time for the people only interested in my opinion on the TV show to tune out. Because now, as promised, it's time to talk about something that has, for some unknown and idiotic reason, become controversial. And I should preface the rest of this video with a massive disclaimer. I can say as many times as I possibly can that everything stated is just my opinion, but I'm still going to make a lot of people angry. I've actually had this video on the back burner for a while, but I've held off. I knew that woke would be put in the thumbnail, and I even thought about putting one of those goofy Brie Larson faces that populated the thumbnails of toxic YouTube for years, but I decided against it, but still kept the word woke in there. And that alone will spark so many wars in the comments, but please don't do that. Though, if you feel attacked when I bring up some of these points, you might want to take a step back and think about why that is. I'm also going to try to take a step back as I discuss this topic, but inevitably, a lot of people will still be upset. And I could jump to the obvious reasons that people look for things to hate and therefore only see negative aspects of it, but I think it's more than that. There are some who just flat out refuse to have any fun with She-Hulk, convincing themselves or letting them be convinced by others that it's boring, badly written, or unnecessarily woke. And even more people are upset at the idea that supposed forced diversity or wokeness is ruining media. I mean, the discourse on whether or not movies need to have political undertones will always be argued until the end of time, and that is really the heart of this issue. But I want to get right in front of that and say, nah. Movies will always have a message. A storyteller may create something with entertainment solely in mind, but they're still telling a 3-act story with character development and narrative decision-making throughout. I'm about to say something that isn't entirely true, but you know what? To me, woke is just a buzzword invented by people too scared to say inclusive, because the word inclusive has a positive connotation, while woke gives off the thought that it is inherently bad. That, or they mean that the story just has a message to be learned from it. You know, the meaning behind storytelling? But if we look to the actual definition of the word, or at least Merriam-Webster's, they describe it as aware of and actively attentive to important societal facts and issues, especially issues of racial and social justice, which is essentially what I've talked about, but it can't be overstated how important it is to clearly define these terms. And that's pretty much why I wanted to make this video, because that is quite possibly the most important issue in all of entertainment. Art is entirely subjective, and no matter how on the nose something is, each viewer is going to have their own personal takeaway. But the stories in a movie or a TV show must also be relatable. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to get invested in these adventures. And along with that, conflict is what makes those adventures interesting, which comes from bringing out internal or external problems and attempting to address them. Without any of that narrative allegory, storytelling would be the most dull thing in the world. And when people say that a modern story is woke, they usually imply that it is forced and unnecessary. And there are rare examples of horrible studio heads pushing agendas on audiences, but that number is so small and inconsequential, it barely should even be brought up. Because the real reality of the situation is that all of these companies and brands want to have inclusiveness because they believe that by having that, they might make more money. And statistically, that is true. You can argue that it's not the case all you want, but inclusive stories just make money. There's no such thing as go woke, go broke. There's just too many examples proving that very idea wrong. The Marvels may not have done that well, and that's thanks to Marvel's failed multiverse, a whole can of worms I've already opened in plenty of other videos. But just look at Brie Larson and Captain Marvel's refugee storyline, and that may have been bolstered by being released between a couple Avengers movies, but it was 110% woke and still made $1 billion. And if that alone doesn't convince you, just look to George Lucas and all of Star Wars. And I know that this comment will start yet another war in the comments, but come on. He clearly created Star Wars to be an allegory for how terrible American imperialism had gotten, and every other story about a group of rebels going against an unstoppable imperialistic force. What do you think that's about? But getting back to alleged forced diversity, because while I will never be a fan of ghoulish, more likely than not white, old, and male studio heads pushing agendas that they have no experience in, that narrative is then given to someone who does care. Those storytellers tasked with actually depicting that woke inclusivity are the people who have lived that life and, if they're willing, can give personal anecdotes and metaphors about the problems being dived into. And let me tell you, I see no reason why having new perspectives and protagonists wouldn't be awesome. Getting the same old boring superhero story we've seen a dozen times already is why superhero fatigue is a thing. Besides, superheroes have always been there to teach us lessons through metaphor. Lessons like how bullies and bigots are the villains. And more than that, they're just pathetic. Because there's nothing sadder than attacking someone for no better reason than to make yourself feel superior. Frankly, the best way to interact with bigots and toxic fans is to just not. No, I'm serious. Ignoring them is the smartest thing you can do, because the moment you engage, they immediately win. Which is easier said than done, because those vile fans are everywhere, and I'm making a video like this after all. And I'll be the first to admit how good it feels to prove people like that wrong. Yet whenever I do that, I'm just falling into the same toxic trappings that they are, attempting to demonstrate that my opinion is superior to someone else's, which is just never a healthy way of arguing your side. And that's really the main takeaway from this video, because if there's one thing you should think about before clicking on the next video essay, it's that empathy, compassion, and generosity are so much more helpful than anyone ever truly realizes. I learned a lot about right and wrong from my parents, but most of all, superhero media taught me that kindness and hope can be just as powerful and impactful as any other superpower. That's something even Batman preaches. Maybe that's why I get lost trying to understand how someone who claims that they're a superhero fan would spout off something that is the exact opposite of kind. And along those lines, if to get invested in a narrative, the protagonist needs to look like you, whether that be your race or sexual orientation or whatever, and you genuinely can't empathize even slightly with anyone else, then let me tell you, you got a lot of other stuff to work out before jumping into this conversation. But while you work on that, I do have a request. And I know that those toxic guys already clicked off and I'm just preaching to the choir at this point, but if you can't use basic empathy, then just let it go. Because none of this has any drastic effect on your life whatsoever. But drop a comment and let me know what you think about all of this. If you have a legitimate criticism against She-Hulk, let me know, because I'm genuinely interested in how the show could be done better, such as how its budget ballooned out and became far too expensive, the real reason we might not ever get a season 2. Also, if you didn't notice, at times my audio sounded almost auto-tuned or underwater, and I have no idea how to fix that. If anyone knows any solutions aside from just buying a new mic, please let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe for weekly video essays and reviews, and enjoy a delicious sandwich.